The year is 1913. G.H. Hardy sits in his rooms at Trinity College, Cambridge, surrounded by the mathematical elegance of the world's oldest and most prestigious academic institution. Outside, the manicured lawn stretched toward medieval stone. Inside, order prevails. Hardy is 36 years old, already one of England's leading pure mathematicians, a man who believes that mathematics is discovered, not invented, that somewhere in the fabric of reality, eternal truths wait to be unveiled through rigorous proof. The morning is typical for Hardy. He has already completed his ritualistic breakfast, always the same items consumed in the same order. He has read the cricket scores in the Times, analysing batting averages with the same precision he brings to number theory. His rooms are austere, almost monastic. Books line the walls in perfect order. Papers sit in neat stacks on his desk. Everything has its place. This is how Hardy lives, structured, controlled, devoted entirely to the abstract beauty of pure mathematics. The Morning Post arrives. Among the usual correspondence lies a package from India. Hardy almost discards it. He receives crank letters regularly, amateurs claiming to have squared the circle or proven Fermat's last theorem. Most are immediately recognizable as nonsense, the work of enthusiastic autodidacts who don't understand why their proofs fail. Hardy has developed an efficient system for dealing with such correspondence, a quick glance to confirm it's worthless, then into the waste bin. But something makes him open this one. Perhaps it's the quality of the handwriting, careful and precise despite the obvious poverty of the paper. Perhaps it's something in the opening lines that suggests genuine mathematical thought rather than crank theorizing. 9 pages unfold, no introduction, no credentials, just page after page of mathematical formulas, theorems stated without proof, results claimed without derivation. Hardy begins to read more carefully. Some formulas look familiar. These are known results, things any competent mathematician would recognize. Some look wrong, apparent errors in calculation or reasoning, and some, Hardy will later say this moment changed his life, some look utterly impossible. He reads one formula, reads it again. The formula concerns infinite series, those endlessly extending sums that seem to defy intuition. This particular formula claims an equivalence that Hardy has never seen before. If it's true, and his initial calculation suggests it might be, it represents a genuine breakthrough. But if it's true, how did someone derive it? The standard techniques Hardy knows wouldn't lead to this result. He calls for Littlewood, his closest collaborator. John Eden, sir. Littlewood is perhaps the only person at Cambridge whose mathematical ability Hardy considers equal to his own. They have worked together for years, developing a partnership so close that jokes circulate about whether Littlewood actually exists or is merely a pseudonym Hardy uses for his weaker work. Littlewood arrives in the late afternoon. Hardy shows him the letter without preamble. "What do you make of this?" he asks, pointing to one of the more extraordinary formulas. Littlewood studies it in silence. Minutes pass. He picks up a pencil and begins checking the calculation. More silence. Finally, he looks up. "Where did this come from?" Littlewood asks. "India," Hardy replies. "A clerk. No credentials, no institutional affiliation. Just these 9 pages. But they work through the evening, checking, calculating, trying to understand. Hardy's rooms grow dark. Neither man notices. They light lamps and continue working. Some results they can verify using known techniques. Others require them to develop new approaches on the spot. Still others resist their combined efforts entirely. The formulas seem to be true, but neither Hardy nor Littlewood can find a path to proving them. By midnight, they reach a conclusion that seems absurd. Whoever wrote this letter is either a fraud of extraordinary sophistication or a mathematical genius of the highest order, and the signature at the bottom reads, S. Ramanujan, a clerk at the Madras Port Trust. "If he's a fraud," Littlewood says slowly, He's put more work into this deception than most genuine mathematicians put into their entire careers. And if he's genuine, Hardy asks, then we may be looking at the most remarkable mathematical mind of our generation, Littlewood responds, possibly of any generation. The question that will haunt Hardy for the rest of his life forms in that moment. How could someone produce mathematics like this from a clerk's desk in colonial India? Where did these formulas come from? Who was this man? And buried deeper, a question Hardy doesn't yet know to ask. What does it mean when genius appears in a place the Western world has been trained not to look? Hardy sits up late that night, alone now, going through the letter again. He's trying to understand not just the mathematics, but the mind behind it. Some of the results suggest familiarity with advanced European mathematics. Others suggest complete ignorance of even basic modern techniques. The notation is idiosyncratic, sometimes archaic. There are gaps where standard steps are skipped, as if the writer finds them too obvious to mention. And there's a quality to the formulas themselves, an elegance, a rightness, that Hardy recognizes from his own best work. He thinks about his life, his career, his place in the mathematical world. He has achieved everything he set out to achieve. He holds a prestigious position at the world's most prestigious institution. His work is respected. His methods are sound, and yet, looking at these 9 pages from India, he feels something he hasn't felt in years. Genuine surprise. Whoever this Ramanujan is, he's seeing mathematics in a way Hardy doesn't fully understand. And Hardy, who prides himself on understanding, finds this both thrilling and unsettling. Before we continue with Ramanujan's extraordinary story, I want to ask you for something. If you're finding this fascinating, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support makes these deep dives possible, and I genuinely want to know, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop a comment and tell me. I love hearing from you. Now, let's go back to the beginning, to a temple town in southern India, and understand how a boy with almost no formal training came to write those 9 pages that baffled the finest mathematical mind in England. Ramanujan was born on December 22, 1887 in Erode, a town in the Tamil Nadu region of southern India, during the height of the British Raj. His family moved soon after to Kumbakonam, a temple town known throughout the region for its scholarship. Kumbakonam was sometimes called the Cambridge of South India, and this was not entirely a compliment. It meant the town had absorbed the colonial education system completely. British examinations, British curricula, British assumptions about what knowledge mattered and what didn't. But Kumbakonam was also a town of profound cultural richness. Its streets were lined with temples, some dating back more than 1,000 years. The Mahamaham festival drew pilgrims from across India every 12 years. Sanskrit scholars taught in traditional schools. Musicians practiced classical ragas. The town existed in a strange duality, deeply rooted in Tamil Brahmin tradition, while simultaneously serving as an outpost of British colonial education. The Cauvery River flowed nearby, its waters considered sacred. During festival times, the ghats would fill with devotees performing rituals unchanged for centuries. The air would smell of camphor and jasmine, incense and cooking fires. This was the world that shaped Ramanujan's earliest perceptions, a world where the sacred and the everyday were inseparable, where mathematics and music and worship all flowed from the same source. His father, K. Srinivasa Ramanujan, worked as a clerk in a sari shop, earning about 20 rupees a month. The work was tedious, maintaining account books, tracking inventory, dealing with customers. Srinivasa was a quiet man, conventional in his habits and expectations. He had learned to navigate the colonial system successfully enough to secure stable employment, and he expected his children to do the same. The family was Brahmin, the highest caste, which meant they had social status but very little money. This combination was common in colonial India. Traditional hierarchies persisted even as economic power shifted to those who accommodated British rule. Being Brahmin meant observing strict dietary restrictions, performing daily rituals, maintaining ritual purity. It meant certain opportunities were available, but also certain constraints were non-negotiable. Ramanujan's mother, Kamala, was the dominant force in the household. She was a woman of intense presence, strong-willed, deeply religious, and utterly convinced of her own spiritual insights. She sang devotional songs at the local temple, her voice carrying across the courtyard during evening prayers. She had visions, she claimed, moments when the goddess Namagiri spoke to her directly. Whether these were genuine mystical experiences or the product of religious fervor, they were real to her, and she organized her life around them. She would later claim she'd had dreams about her son's destiny even before he was born, visions that he was meant for something extraordinary. In these dreams, she said, the goddess showed her mathematical symbols, though Kamala couldn't read or write in any sophisticated way. She saw numbers floating in temples of light. She saw her son surrounded by scrolls covered in strange markings. She took these dreams as prophecy. 2 of Ramanujan's brothers died in infancy, one from fever, one from complications that were never properly diagnosed. Only one younger brother, Lakshmi Narasimhan, survived past childhood. Death was common in those years. Infant mortality was high. Diseases that are now easily treatable killed children regularly. When Ramanujan was 2, he contracted smallpox. His small body burned with fever. His skin erupted in pustules. Most children died. Ramanujan didn't. His mother took it as a sign. She became even more protective after his recovery, more convinced that he had been spared for a reason. She watched over him constantly. She made offerings at the temple, thanking Namagiri for his survival. And she began to tell him stories, not children's tales, but stories about destiny and divine purpose, about being chosen for something greater than an ordinary life. The world Ramanujan inherited was one of profound contradiction. India was experiencing what historians call the Indian Renaissance, a flowering of literature, philosophy, and art that drew from traditional sources while engaging with Western thought. Bengali poets were creating new forms, freedom fighters were beginning to organize, intellectuals were debating what independence might look like, what India could become if the British left. But it was also a world of systematic subjugation. British colonial rule wasn't just political, it was epistemological. The education system taught Indian children that knowledge worth having came from England, that their own intellectual traditions were superstition, that the path to success meant erasing your culture and adopting British speech, British dress, British ways of thinking. In schools across India, children learned British history, but not their own. They memorized the kings of England, but learned nothing about the Mughal emperors or the Chola dynasty. They studied Shakespeare and Milton, but not the Sanskrit classics or Tamil poetry. The message was clear and constant. You are inferior, your culture is backward, your only hope for advancement is to become as British as possible. For a poor Brahmin boy in Kumbakonam, the expected trajectory was clear. Excel in the British examination system, secure a government clerkship, support your extended family, marry whomever your parents chose, and live a life of modest respectability. Perhaps, if you were very fortunate and very obedient, you might rise to a position of minor authority within the colonial administration. The system was designed to produce clerks, not thinkers, compliance, not creativity. Ramanujan entered primary school at age 5. The school was a single-room building with a thatched roof, benches worn smooth by generations of students. The teacher was a strict disciplinarian who believed that learning happened through memorization and repetition, backed by corporal punishment when necessary. Students sat in rows reciting multiplication tables in unison, their voices rising and falling in practiced rhythm. The records show he was an exceptional student in arithmetic. While other children struggled with basic calculations, Ramanujan solved problems almost instantly. He could multiply large numbers in his head. He could spot patterns in sequences that others didn't see. The teacher noticed but didn't quite know what to do with this ability. Exceptional students were unusual, and the curriculum didn't have provisions for them. By age 10, he had entered Town Higher Secondary School in Kumbakonam, and it became clear he wasn't just good at mathematics, he was obsessed with it. While other boys played cricket in the dusty field behind the school, he sat in the shade working through problems. While they memorized poetry for examinations, he filled the margins of his notebooks with equations. While they gossiped and formed friendships, he remained apart, lost in numerical contemplation. His classmates found him odd. He spoke little. He showed no interest in the social dynamics of school life. During lunch, while others ate together and talked, Ramanujan would eat quickly and then return to whatever mathematical problem occupied him. Some boys mocked him, others left him alone. A few were curious about what he was doing, but when he tried to explain, his explanations were incomprehensible. At 15, something happened that would determine everything that followed. A fellow student, whose name has been lost to history, lent him a book. The student had borrowed it from a college library and didn't find it particularly interesting, but he thought Ramanujan might. The book was G.S. Carr's Synopsis of Elementary Results in Pure and Applied Mathematics. To understand what this meant for Ramanujan, you need to understand what this book was. It wasn't a textbook, it was a collection, a compendium of thousands of mathematical results, theorems and formulas, organized by topic, with minimal explanation and almost no proofs. Carr had created it as a study guide for Cambridge examinations, assuming students would already know how these results were derived. The book was dense, almost unreadable for anyone without extensive mathematical background. It listed formulas like a catalogue, jumping from topic to topic with no narrative thread. There was no pedagogy, no hand-holding, no careful progression from simple to complex. It was simply a reference work intended for students who had already mastered the material and needed a convenient summary. Ramanujan had no such background. He opened Carr's book and saw page after page of elegant formulas presented as facts. And something ignited in his mind. He began working backward, trying to figure out how these results could be proven. He had no teacher to guide him. He had no library of advanced texts. He had Carr's list of results, cheap paper that he often reused multiple times to save money, and a fierce, consuming need to understand. This is where the story usually emphasizes genius, the natural gift, the mystical talent, but pause on what's actually happening. Ramanujan is teaching himself mathematics in isolation, using a book that wasn't meant to be used this way, inventing his own methods because he has no access to the standard ones. He's developing his own notation because he doesn't know the conventional symbols. Where European mathematicians use one set of symbols, Ramanujan invents another. Where the standard approach uses calculus, Ramanujan develops algebraic techniques. He's reinventing mathematics from scratch, and he doesn't know he's doing it. He thinks he's learning what everyone knows. He doesn't realize he's walking down paths no one has walked before. His days take on a pattern. He wakes before dawn. He performs the morning rituals his mother insists on, prayers, ablutions, offerings to the household gods. Then, while the rest of the family sleeps, he sits on the floor of the small room they all share, a slate across his lap, and begins working. He works through problems from Carr's book. He fills his slate with calculations, then wipes it clean and continues. He loses track of time. His mother brings him breakfast. He eats absently, barely tasting the food. She watches him with a mixture of pride and confusion. She doesn't understand what he's doing, but she recognizes the intensity, the devotion. It reminds her of religious ecstasy, the way saints are described as being lost in contemplation of the divine. At 16, he entered Government Arts College in Kumbakonam on a scholarship. The scholarship was based on his performance in the entrance examinations. He had scored exceptionally high in mathematics, nearly perfect. The other subjects were adequate. He seemed destined for success. His family celebrated. His father saw the path laid out clearly: degree, government position, security. His mother saw divine favor manifesting, and then everything fell apart. The problem was simple and total. Ramanujan could not bring himself to care about anything except mathematics. The British examination system required proficiency in all subjects: English, Sanskrit, physiology, history. Each subject weighted equally. Excellence in one area couldn't compensate for failure in another. The system was designed to produce well-rounded colonial administrators, not specialists. Ramanujan attended mathematics lectures and absorbed everything instantly. His professors noticed him immediately. Here was a student who could solve problems that challenged advanced learners, who asked questions that revealed deep understanding, who seemed to intuit mathematical truths without needing to work through standard derivations. But he ignored everything else. He stayed up all night working on mathematical problems and slept through morning classes in English literature. He filled notebooks with theorems while his required coursework in physiology languished untouched. When examinations came, he could answer the mathematics questions in half the allotted time, spending the remaining time working on mathematical problems he'd invented himself. But he failed English, he failed Sanskrit, he failed history. The professors who taught those subjects tried to understand. Some were sympathetic. One English professor pulled him aside and explained that talent in mathematics was valuable, but in the colonial system it wasn't enough. You needed credentials. You needed to demonstrate mastery across domains. Specialization, the professor explained gently, wasn't recognized by the examination system. Ramanujan tried to care. He attended more English lectures, he made efforts to complete assignments, but the material seemed trivial to him, and worse, irrelevant. What did it matter whether he could pass Shakespearean verse when there were unsolved problems in number theory? What value was there in memorizing historical dates when infinite series waited to be understood? At the end of his first year, he failed his examinations. He lost his scholarship. His family, already poor, could not afford to support him. He was 17 years old, and the only path to respectability had just closed. His father was angry, not shouting, dramatic anger, but the quiet, bitter disappointment of a man who has worked hard within the system and cannot understand why his son refuses to do the same. His mother oscillated between faith that this was part of a larger divine plan and fear that she had misunderstood the goddess's message. He tried again. He enrolled at Pachayappa's college in Madras in 1906. Madras was the big city, larger and more cosmopolitan than Kumbakonam. Perhaps a new environment would help. Perhaps different professors, different students, different pressures would allow him to balance his obsession with mathematics against the demands of the curriculum. It didn't. The pattern was the same each time: brilliant performance in mathematics, complete neglect of everything else. The examination system had no category for what Ramanujan was. You either passed all subjects or you failed. There was no accommodation for specialized genius, no recognition that someone might be transcendent in one area while inadequate in others. By 1907, Ramanujan had left formal education completely. He was 19 years old. He had no degree, he had no qualifications, he had no prospects. What he had was 3 notebooks filled with thousands of mathematical results that nobody except him could understand. These are what historians now call the lost years, 1907 to 1912, 5 years when Ramanujan disappeared from institutional view. We know less about this period than any other part of his life. There are no school records, no publications, no official documentation. We know he lived in poverty. We know his family was ashamed. We know that at one point he ran away from home and was missing for months. The running away happened after a particularly bitter argument with his father. Srinivasa had secured him a tutoring position with a merchant's son. The pay was minimal, but it was something. Ramanujan was expected to teach basic arithmetic to help the boy prepare for school examinations. Instead, Ramanujan spent the sessions trying to explain advanced mathematical concepts to a student who had no interest and no ability to understand. The merchant complained. The position ended. Srinivasa confronted his son. Why couldn't he just do what was asked? Why did he insist on pursuing mathematics that had no practical value, that earned no money, that led nowhere? The argument escalated. Ramanujan left. He disappeared into Madras, surviving on the edges, taking odd jobs that lasted only until he alienated whoever hired him by spending his time on mathematics instead of work. When he returned months later, he wouldn't say where he'd been. He was thinner, his clothes more worn, but his notebooks were fuller. Whatever else had happened during those months, he had kept working. We also know he kept working throughout these years. The notebooks from this period show a mind operating at extraordinary intensity. He's not just doing mathematics, he's inventing it. Results pour out of him, theorems about prime numbers, infinite series, continued fractions, hypergeometric functions, modular forms. Some of these results are rediscoveries of things already known in European mathematics, but many are completely new, and some are so strange that when mathematicians look at them decades later, they still can't understand where they came from. And here's what's crucial. Ramanujan isn't writing proofs. He's stating results. Page after page of formulas, elegant and precise, with no explanation of how he arrived at them. It's as if he's reporting what he sees rather than deriving what he proves. Years later, he'll tell people that the formulas come to him in dreams, that the goddess Namagiri shows them to him, that he wakes up with equations written in his mind. Whether this is literal truth or metaphorical description of an intuitive process, we'll never know. But the notebooks from these years show someone who is experiencing mathematics as revelation. The notebooks themselves are remarkable physical objects. Ramanujan used cheap paper, the kind that yellows and becomes brittle. He wrote in a small, precise hand, cramming as much as possible onto each page to conserve paper. When he ran out of space, he wrote in the margins. When the margins filled, he wrote between lines. The pages are dense with symbols, formulas flowing into one another with barely a pause. There are almost no words, just mathematics. Occasionally, he'll write a brief note, interesting next to one formula, verify next to another, but mostly it's pure symbolic expression. To look at the notebooks is to see a mind communing directly with mathematical reality, cutting out the intermediary of language. In 1909, two things happened. First, Ramanujan nearly died. He developed a hydrocele, a painful swelling that required surgery. The surgery was crude by modern standards. No antibiotics, minimal anesthesia, a high risk of infection. He survived, but barely. The recovery was long and painful. He lay in his mother's house, weak and feverish, unable to work. The enforced idleness tormented him. As soon as he could sit up, he asked for his notebooks. Second, his family arranged his marriage. He was 21. His bride, Janaki Ammal, was 10 years old. This requires context. Child marriage was common in Tamil Brahmin culture at the time. The marriage was formalized, but Janaki would not live with Ramanujan as a wife until she reached puberty. This was the custom. The marriage created alliances between families, provided security, ensured continuity. It was how things were done. It's important not to judge the past by present standards, but it's also important not to romanticize it. Ramanujan's marriage was arranged without his meaningful input to a child he barely knew, at a moment when he had no means to support a family. The ceremony took place in Rajendram, Janaki's village. Ramanujan participated in the rituals but seemed distracted, his mind elsewhere. Janaki, dressed in silk and jewelry, was too young to understand what the ceremony meant. The marriage created pressure. He now had formal responsibilities, a wife, in-laws, expectations. He needed income, but he had no degree and no qualifications. The only thing he had was mathematics that nobody understood. In 1910, he met V. Ramaswamy Iyer, the founder of the Indian Mathematical Society. This meeting is often glossed over in Western accounts of Ramanujan's life, but it's crucial. Iyer was the first trained mathematician to see Ramanujan's work and recognize it for what it was. Iyer was a visionary in his own right. He had founded the Indian Mathematical Society in 1907 with the explicit goal of fostering mathematical research in India, independent of British institutional structures. He believed that Indians could contribute to mathematics at the highest level, that colonial subjugation was political and economic, not intellectual. When Iyer first met Ramanujan, he was struck by the contradiction. Here was a young man, poorly dressed, speaking English with a heavy accent, claiming to have made discoveries in mathematics. Iyer's initial instinct was skepticism. He'd met many young men who overestimated their abilities. But he agreed to look at the notebooks. What he saw astonished him. Page after page of results, some elementary, some advanced, some seemingly impossible. Iyer realized immediately that this was someone extraordinary, but he also realized that Ramanujan needed help, someone who could verify the results, provide feedback, connect him to the broader mathematical world. He began introducing Ramanujan to other mathematicians in Madras. R. Ramachandra Rao, a civil servant and amateur mathematician, became an early supporter. Rao met Ramanujan in 1910 and was initially skeptical. Ramanujan's appearance didn't inspire confidence. His clothes were shabby, his manner diffident. But Rao agreed to listen. Ramanujan began explaining his work on infinite series. Rao, who had studied mathematics at university, tried to follow. Some of the results were familiar, others were completely new. Ramanujan worked through calculations on a slate, his hands moving quickly, his voice soft but confident. Rao found himself lost within minutes. The methods Ramanujan was using were unlike anything in standard texts. Finally, Rao stopped him. "Do you have proofs for these results?" he asked. Ramanujan paused. "Some," he said. "The others I know are true." "But how do you know?" "I see them." Ramanujan replied simply. Rao stared at him. Then he made a decision that would prove crucial. He began providing Ramanujan with a small monthly stipend, enough to survive, to buy paper, to continue working. It wasn't much, but it was support. It was recognition. One of these connections led to a clerical position at the Madras Port Trust in 1912. The job paid 30 rupees a month, not much, but stability. The work was tedious, recording shipments, tracking cargo, maintaining ledgers, but it was regular employment and it came with a crucial benefit. More importantly, his supervisor, S. Narayana Iyer, was sympathetic to Ramanujan's mathematical work. Narayana Iyer was an unusual man for a colonial bureaucrat. He had mathematical training and understood, at least partially, what Ramanujan was attempting. More than that, he believed that colonial Indians had the right to pursue knowledge for its own sake, not just to serve British administrative needs. He allowed Ramanujan time during work hours to pursue mathematics. When the office was quiet, when the day's required work was done, Ramanujan would pull out his notebooks and work. Narayana Iyer looked the other way, and he suggested something that would change everything. Ramanujan should write to mathematicians in England. The suggestion was both obvious and radical. Obvious because English mathematicians were the recognized authorities, the people who could validate Ramanujan's work. Radical because it meant an Indian clerk with no credentials would be asking British academics to take him seriously. The colonial hierarchy made such a request almost absurd. Why would Cambridge mathematicians respond to someone from the Madras Port Trust? but Narayana Iyer helped him draft letters. They worked on the phrasing, trying to strike a balance between deference and confidence, between acknowledging Ramanujan's lack of formal training and asserting the value of his results. Ramanujan wrote to 3 prominent British mathematicians. 2 of them, H.F. Baker and E.W. Hobson, didn't respond. Perhaps they never read the letters. Perhaps they read them and dismissed them as the work of a crank. Perhaps they simply had no time for unsolicited correspondence from unknown Indians. Whatever the reason, silence. The third was G.H. Hardy. And Hardy, despite his initial skepticism, looked closely enough to see what was there. The letter Hardy received in January 1913 was unlike anything he'd encountered. It opened with an awkward formality. "I beg to introduce myself to you as a clerk in the accounts department of the Port Trust office at Madras on a salary of only £20 per annum. I am now about 23 years of age." The age was wrong. Ramanujan was 25 and the salary understated. But what followed was 9 pages of mathematical assertions, some trivial, some known, some wrong, and some that seemed to violate the boundaries of what was mathematically possible. Hardy spent the evening going through the letter with Littlewood. They tried to understand what they were seeing. Some of the formulas were famous results, which suggested Ramanujan had access to mathematical literature. But others were completely unknown, and a few seemed to be contradicted by established theorems. Either this was an elaborate fraud, or they were looking at work from someone who had reinvented large portions of mathematics and gone beyond it. "What do we do with this?" Littlewood asked finally. Hardy was quiet for a long moment. Then, "We respond. We ask for more. We see if this is real." Hardy decided to respond. His letter to Ramanujan was cautious but encouraging. He pointed out errors, gently, precisely. He asked for proofs of specific results. He requested clarification on methods, and he suggested something that must have seemed impossible to Ramanujan: that he come to Cambridge. But there was a problem. Ramanujan was a Brahmin. Orthodox Brahmin practice forbade crossing the ocean. To leave India meant ritual pollution, loss of caste, spiritual danger. The ocean was a boundary not meant to be crossed. The sacred texts were clear on this point. Ramanujan's mother refused permission. She had visions of her son's destiny, yes, but they involved glory in India, not exile to England. The goddess Namagiri, she was certain, would not ask her son to violate Dharma, to pollute himself by crossing forbidden waters. For months, the matter stalled. Letters went back and forth between Hardy and Ramanujan. Hardy grew frustrated. Ramanujan was clearly a genius, but he needed proper training, proper collaboration. He needed to be at Cambridge, working with people who could understand and develop his ideas, but the religious prohibition seemed insurmountable. Then Kamala Tamil had a dream. She claimed the goddess Namagiri appeared to her, not in symbolic form, but directly, radiantly, speaking in a voice that resonated through Kamala Tamil's entire being. The goddess commanded her not to stand in the way of her son's purpose. The work he was meant to do required him to cross the ocean. The Dharma she was protecting was smaller than the Dharma he was meant to fulfill. Whether this was genuine religious experience, maternal wisdom finding a face-saving solution, or retroactive invention, we don't know, but the permission was granted. Ramanujan himself was conflicted. He believed in the goddess. He believed in the prohibition against ocean crossing, but he also believed in the mathematics, in the work that waited to be done. He consulted with pandits, seeking religious sanction. Some said the prohibition was absolute. Others suggested that extraordinary circumstances might justify exceptions. The debate went on for weeks. Finally, he decided. The mathematics mattered more. If he was polluted by the crossing, if he lost caste, if he suffered spiritual consequences, so be it. The work was worth it. On March 17, 1914, Ramanujan boarded a ship for England. He was 26 years old. He had never been outside Tamil Nadu. He spoke functional English but with a heavy accent. He had no formal degree, and he was about to enter the most elite mathematical environment in the world. The crossing took 3 weeks. The ship was crowded. British civil servants returning from postings in India, merchants, a few Indian students heading to English universities. Ramanujan kept to himself. He struggled with the vegetarian diet on a ship where meat was standard at every meal. The cooks tried to accommodate him, but their understanding of vegetarian requirements was limited. He ate rice and boiled vegetables and lost weight. He spent his days on deck watching the ocean, thinking about the mathematical problems he was working on. At night, in his cramped cabin, he wrote in his notebooks by lamplight. The motion of the ship made writing difficult, but he persisted. The mathematics was his anchor, the familiar refuge in an increasingly alien world. He carried his notebooks everywhere, protective of them in a way he wasn't about his few possessions. If the ship sank, if he drowned, at least the mathematics might survive. That thought comforted him. When he arrived in London and took the train to Cambridge, he entered a world that was, in every way, designed to exclude people like him. The architecture was stone and cold, the people were pale and distant, the sky was grey in a way the Indian sky never was. Everything felt wrong, the temperature, the light, the food, the rhythm of daily life. Cambridge in 1914 was not diverse. It was not welcoming to outsiders. It was a bastion of British class privilege, where accent and background mattered as much as ability, where tradition was sacred and innovation suspect. Indians were rare, Indian mathematicians were rarer still, and an Indian mathematician with no degree, no formal training, and a tendency to state theorems without proof was essentially unimaginable. The students Ramanujan encountered at Cambridge were the sons of aristocrats and wealthy merchants, educated at elite public schools, fluent in the unspoken codes of British upper-class life. They knew which fork to use at formal dinners. They understood the rituals of high table. They could discuss cricket and rowing with easy familiarity. Ramanujan knew none of this. He ate with his hands, as he had his whole life. He didn't understand the significance of academic gowns or the protocols of college hierarchy. He spoke English well enough to discuss mathematics, but struggled with casual conversation and British humour. Hardy understood this. He took on the role of advocate, protector, and collaborator. He secured funding for Ramanujan through the University of Madras and Trinity College. He arranged rooms, not luxurious, but private, quiet, suitable for work. He introduced him to other mathematicians, carefully, selectively, to people who might be open-minded enough to see past Ramanujan's unconventional background, and he began the delicate work of trying to teach Ramanujan rigorous proof techniques without destroying the intuitive genius that made his work extraordinary. The collaboration between Hardy and Ramanujan is one of the most remarkable in the history of mathematics. Hardy was the epitome of the Cambridge analytical tradition, precise, rigorous, dedicated to proof as the foundation of mathematical truth. Ramanujan worked from intuition, pattern recognition, and what he described as divine inspiration. Hardy believed mathematics was discovered through logical deduction. Ramanujan experienced mathematics as something closer to vision. Their first working sessions were awkward. Hardy would ask Ramanujan to explain how he'd arrived at a result. Ramanujan would struggle to articulate the process. "I saw it," he would say. It became clear. Hardy would press for details. What steps had he taken? What calculations had led him there? Often, Ramanujan couldn't answer. The results came to him whole, complete. The process of derivation wasn't sequential for him. It was simultaneous, a sudden perception of how things must be. Hardy later wrote that Ramanujan's method was incomprehensible to him. He would state a result, and when Hardy asked how he knew it was true, Ramanujan would say he'd seen it, that it was obvious, that the goddess had shown him. Hardy would demand proof, and Ramanujan would produce something, sometimes a valid argument, sometimes an incomplete sketch, sometimes nothing at all. And yet when Hardy checked the results independently, they were almost always correct. Slowly, they developed a working method. Ramanujan would present results. Hardy would assess them, identifying which were known, which were new, which were promising enough to pursue. Then they would work together on developing proofs, with Hardy guiding Ramanujan through the rigorous techniques that European mathematics demanded. It was collaborative in a deep sense, not just two people working together, but two fundamentally different approaches to mathematics learning from each other. Hardy learned to trust intuition more, to allow space for results that couldn't immediately be proven but felt true. Ramanujan learned to value proof, to see that verification mattered, that intuition alone wasn't enough for the mathematical community to accept a result. The first year in Cambridge was productive. Ramanujan published his first papers in English journals, proper papers with proofs, meeting European standards. Hardy helped him formalize his methods. They began collaborating on the partition function, a problem about the ways integers can be broken into sums. The partition function had frustrated mathematicians for years. The question was simple: how many ways can you break a number into a sum of positive integers? For small numbers, you can count by hand, but as numbers grow, the count explodes and finding a pattern seemed impossible. The work sessions between Hardy and Ramanujan developed their own rhythm. Most mornings, Ramanujan would arrive at Hardy's rooms carrying his notebooks. He would settle into the chair by the window, always the same chair, and begin showing Hardy what he'd discovered overnight. Hardy learned to recognize the signs. When Ramanujan's eyes lit up in a particular way, something significant had emerged. When he spoke quickly, stumbling over words, it meant he was trying to describe something he could see but couldn't quite articulate. Hardy would listen, making notes, asking clarifying questions. Often the conversation would shift mid-sentence from English to mathematical notation, the symbols becoming a shared language more precise than words. They would work through the morning, breaking only for tea, which Ramanujan would drink without milk, another dietary accommodation that the college staff learned to anticipate. Littlewood would sometimes join them, and the dynamic would shift. Where Hardy was methodical and precise, Littlewood was playful, prone to making intuitive leaps that sometimes matched Ramanujan's own approach. The three of them would cover Hardy's blackboard with equations, erasing and rewriting, building arguments that combined rigor with inspiration. During these sessions, Ramanujan seemed most alive, most present. The isolation and alienation that marked the rest of his Cambridge experience would fade. Here, in the realm of pure mathematics, cultural differences dissolved. The language of proof, the beauty of elegant formulas, the shared pursuit of truth. These transcended everything else. Their work produced the Hardy-Ramanujan asymptotic formula, a breakthrough that established Ramanujan's reputation in Europe. The formula was elegant, combining techniques from analysis and number theory in ways that hadn't been done before. It involved what are called modular forms, mathematical objects with extraordinary symmetry properties, and showed how these connected to the partition function in unexpected ways. When Hardy presented it at a meeting of the London Mathematical Society, the response was immediate and enthusiastic. The room was filled with Britain's leading mathematicians, men who had spent their careers studying number theory, who understood exactly how difficult the partition problem was. When Hardy reached the key result, when he showed how the formula worked, there was a moment of stunned silence. Then applause. Then a flood of questions. Ramanujan wasn't there. He rarely attended public presentations. But Hardy made sure to emphasize the collaboration, to make clear that the crucial insights had come from Ramanujan. Here was proof that the strange Indian mathematician was the real thing. Here was validation that Hardy's gamble in bringing him to Cambridge had paid off spectacularly. The formula itself was a thing of mathematical beauty. It didn't give exact values for the partition function. That would have been too much to hope for. But it gave an approximation that became more and more accurate as the numbers got larger. And the way it worked, the mathematics underlying it, opened doors to entirely new approaches in number theory. Other mathematicians immediately began building on it, extending it, applying the techniques to related problems. For Ramanujan, the success brought recognition, but also pressure. Now that he had proven himself, expectations grew. Cambridge mathematicians who had been skeptical began seeking him out, asking about his methods, wanting to collaborate. Ramanujan found this attention overwhelming. He wasn't used to explaining his work to multiple people, to fielding questions from those who didn't understand his intuitive approach. Hardy tried to shield him, to manage the demands on his time. But there was only so much he could do. Ramanujan was now a public figure in the mathematical world, and that came with obligations he was ill-equipped to handle. But Ramanujan was struggling. The English weather was cold and damp. He had never experienced cold like this, the kind that seeped into your bones, that made every movement stiff and painful. His rooms at Trinity were heated, but insufficiently. He wore layers of clothing and still shivered. The damp winter of 1914-1915 was particularly brutal. Rain fell for days on end. The sky remained grey from morning until the early afternoon darkness. Ramanujan would stand at his window looking out at the stone courtyards, the wet grass, the students hurrying past with umbrellas, and feel utterly displaced from everything he knew. The food was wrong. He was vegetarian for religious reasons, and wartime rationing was beginning to make vegetables scarce. The college kitchens tried to accommodate him, but their understanding of Indian vegetarian cuisine was minimal. The head cook, Mrs. Patterson, was a kind woman who genuinely wanted to help. She would ask Ramanujan what he needed, what foods he could eat. But the ingredients weren't available. Fresh vegetables were rationed, spices were impossible to find. The rice was a different variety, sticky and bland compared to what he was used to. Ramanujan tried to cook for himself in his rooms, using a small spirit stove. He would heat water for rice, boil vegetables to a mush. The food sustained him, but brought no pleasure. Eating became a mechanical necessity, something to be done quickly so he could return to mathematics. He grew thinner, his clothes hanging loose on his frame. Hardy noticed and worried, but didn't know how to address it. What could he say? The war made everything scarce. The college was doing its best. He was isolated. There were almost no other Indians at Cambridge. Those who were there often came from wealthy, westernized backgrounds, princes and sons of colonial administrators who had been educated in British ways from childhood. They had attended English preparatory schools, spoke with polished accents, wore European clothes without self-consciousness. One of them, a Maharaja's son studying history, invited Ramanujan to tea once. The conversation was awkward. The young prince talked about hunting and polo. Ramanujan had nothing to contribute. The invitation was not repeated. Ramanujan was a poor Brahmin from a temple town who believed a goddess showed him mathematics. He fit nowhere. The other mathematicians at Cambridge respected his work, but found him strange. They would discuss mathematics with enthusiasm, but when the conversation turned to other topics, politics, literature, college gossip, Ramanujan would fall silent. He didn't understand the references, couldn't follow the jokes. There were moments when the isolation became almost unbearable. One evening, walking back to his rooms after a college dinner where he'd eaten almost nothing and spoken even less, Ramanujan heard music drifting from a chapel. He stepped inside. The choir was practicing, their voices rising in harmonies that filled the stone space. He sat in the back, listening. The music was nothing like the devotional songs his mother sang, nothing like the ragas he'd heard at temple festivals. But there was something in it, a pattern, a structure, a beauty that transcended cultural difference. He sat until the practice ended, then walked back to his rooms, feeling slightly less alone. He tried to maintain his religious practices. He performed morning prayers in his rooms, quietly, not wanting to attract attention. He observed dietary restrictions even when it meant going hungry, but the framework of his life had been disrupted. In Kumbakonam, his days had been structured by temple bells and religious festivals, by the rhythms of a sacred calendar. Here, time was measured by college clocks and academic terms, secular and foreign. The loneliness was profound. He wrote letters to his family, but they took weeks to arrive and weeks more to receive responses. His wife Janaki was now living with him in his mother's house in Kumbakonam. The letters she sent were brief, dictated to a scribe because she couldn't write herself. They told him about daily life, festivals, family news, temple gossip. They felt impossibly distant. In 1916, he was awarded a Bachelor of Science degree by research from Cambridge based on his work on highly composite numbers. It was recognition, but it came with a bitter irony. He had failed to get a simple bachelor's degree in India because he couldn't pass examinations in English and Sanskrit. Now, England's most prestigious university was giving him a degree for research that had largely been completed before he arrived. The degree ceremony was formal, elaborate. Ramanujan wore the required academic dress, feeling absurd in the unfamiliar robes. He listened to Latin proclamations he didn't understand. Other students received their degrees, most of them young men from privileged backgrounds for whom this was simply another expected milestone. For Ramanujan, it was validation and alienation simultaneously, proof that his work mattered, but also a reminder of how strange and foreign this world remained. Then his health began to fail. In 1917, he was hospitalized. The diagnosis was tuberculosis, the great killer of the era. The symptoms fit weight loss, persistent cough, fatigue, night sweats. The doctors prescribed rest, fresh air, a nutritious diet. These prescriptions were useless. He couldn't rest because his mind wouldn't stop working. Fresh air in English winter was torture for someone accustomed to tropical heat, and a nutritious diet was impossible given his dietary restrictions and the limitations of wartime rationing. He was moved between hospitals and sanatoriums. Each place was cold, clinical, alienating. The first sanatorium was in Wales, in the countryside, where the air was supposed to be beneficial for tuberculosis patients. Ramanujan spent weeks there, in a ward with other men, all of them coughing, all of them dying slowly. The nurses were efficient but distant. They changed his sheets, brought his meals, took his temperature. But there was no warmth, no connection. Other patients were British men, many of them soldiers recovering from war injuries. They looked at Ramanujan with curiosity and sometimes hostility. What was an Indian doing here, occupying a bed that might go to a British soldier? The war was still raging in France. Men were dying by the thousands. And here was this foreigner, this dark-skinned man, who spoke broken English and kept scribbling in notebooks instead of talking to anyone. One soldier, a man named Thompson who'd lost an arm at the Somme, asked Ramanujan what he was writing. Ramanujan tried to explain mathematics, formulas, patterns in numbers. Thompson laughed, not unkindly. "Bit of an odd thing to do when you're dying, mate," he said. Ramanujan had no response. What could he say? That the mathematics was the only thing keeping him tethered to life? That without the work, there would be nothing left? His weight dropped. The illness kept recurring. Periods of apparent recovery would be followed by sudden relapses. He would feel stronger for a few days, able to sit up, able to eat a little more. The doctors would become optimistic. Then the fever would return, the pain in his abdomen would intensify, and he'd be bedridden again, too weak to do anything but sleep and occasionally scrawl formulas in shaking handwriting. The doctors were baffled. The tuberculosis treatments didn't seem to help. They tried fresh air therapy, wheeling him outside even in winter, the logic being that cold, clean air was beneficial for the lungs. They tried dietary modifications, though there was little they could modify given wartime shortages. They tried bed rest, then mild exercise, then bed rest again. Nothing worked consistently. His condition worsened in ways that didn't match the expected progression of the disease. One doctor, a young man named Dr. Wingate, spent time actually talking to Ramanujan, trying to understand his case. He took a detailed history: the near-fatal illness as a child, the chronic digestive issues, the worsening symptoms after arriving in England. He noted that the symptoms didn't quite match tuberculosis, that something else might be happening. But without better diagnostic tools, without a way to examine the liver directly, he could only speculate. And through it all, he kept working. He filled more notebooks. He wrote to Hardy from his hospital bed, describing new results, new ideas, new patterns he was seeing. The letters were extraordinary documents, pages of mathematical formulas interspersed with brief notes about his health. "I am very weak today, but I have found a remarkable identity for mock theta functions. The doctors say I may be moved to another facility, but first, let me tell you about this infinite series." The work was his lifeline, the one constant in a world of pain and uncertainty. When everything else was stripped away, health, comfort, company, hope, the mathematics remained. The patterns were still there, waiting to be discovered. The goddess, if she existed, was still showing him things. And as long as he could see the mathematics, as long as he could record it, he had purpose. In 1918, two extraordinary honours arrived almost simultaneously. First, Ramanujan was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society, the first Indian to be elected for mathematical work. The Royal Society was the world's oldest scientific academy, founded in 1660, home to Newton and Darwin and every great British scientist since. Ramanujan was 30 years old, with no formal degree until 2 years prior, and he had just been admitted to the most exclusive scientific club on Earth. The citation for his fellowship noted his work on elliptic functions, continued fractions, and the partition function. It acknowledged his remarkable contributions to the theory of numbers. The language was formal, but the meaning was clear. Ramanujan was being recognized as one of the great mathematicians of his generation. Second, he was elected a Fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge, again the first Indian to receive this honour. Trinity was the college of Newton, of Byron, of Hardy himself. To be a fellow meant permanent association with the college, the right to rooms and stipend, recognition at the highest level of British academic life. Hardy visited him in the hospital to deliver the news. He found Ramanujan in bed, thin and weak, but mentally alert. "You've been elected FRS," Hardy said without preamble. Ramanujan's eyes widened. "Truly?" And Fellow of Trinity, both. Ramanujan received it with what Hardy described as quiet pleasure, but no surprise. He had known, somehow, that the work mattered. The recognition simply confirmed what he'd always understood, but the recognition came too late to save him. His health continued to deteriorate. The tuberculosis diagnosis was probably wrong. Recent medical analysis suggests he suffered from hepatic amoebiasis, a parasitic infection of the liver that he likely contracted from contaminated water in England. The symptoms mimicked tuberculosis, but the treatment was different, and the doctors were treating the wrong disease. The infection was slowly destroying his liver. Without proper treatment, it was fatal, and the doctors, working with the medical knowledge of 1918, had no way to diagnose it correctly. In 1919, Ramanujan insisted on returning to India. He was dying, and he wanted to die at home. Hardy tried to convince him to stay. The medical facilities in England were better, he argued. The care was more advanced. But Ramanujan was adamant. He wanted to see his family. He wanted to be in familiar surroundings. He wanted to die in a place where the air smelled right, where he could hear temple bells, where the goddess Namagiri could find him. The journey back was difficult. He was weak, often bedridden. The ship's doctor, Dr. Chandrasekhar, was Indian himself, a graduate of Edinburgh Medical School returning to practice in Madras. He recognized Ramanujan's name. News of the Fellowship of the Royal Society had reached India, and Ramanujan was being celebrated in Indian newspapers as a symbol of what Indians could achieve despite colonial oppression. Dr. Chandrasekhar did what he could to make the journey bearable. He arranged for Ramanujan to have a private cabin. He monitored his condition daily, and he listened when Ramanujan talked about mathematics, understanding enough to appreciate what he was hearing, even if the technical details were beyond him. But he kept working. On the ship, in his cabin, propped up against pillows, he continued to fill notebooks with new mathematics. The motion of the ship made writing difficult. Sometimes he had to stop mid-calculation, overcome by nausea or pain, but he persisted. Dr. Chandrasekhar would find him at odd hours, slate in hand, working by lamplight, his face gaunt, but his eyes focused. "You should rest," the doctor would say. "I will rest when it's finished," Ramanujan would reply. But of course it was never finished. There were always more patterns to explore, more formulas to discover. The mathematics was infinite, and his time was running out. When he arrived in India, the heat hit him like a physical force. After years of English cold, the Chennai sun felt overwhelming. But it was familiar, it smelled right. The air carried scents he recognized: salt from the sea, spices from the market, the particular quality of dust on hot roads. He was home. His family barely recognized him. He had left as a young man, not healthy but functional. He returned skeletal, his skin sallow, his movements slow. He walked with difficulty, leaning on Dr. Chandrasekhar's arm as he descended from the ship. The dock was crowded with people, porters, merchants, families meeting arriving passengers. Ramanujan's family was there, waiting. His mother wept when she saw him. She had received letters, she knew he was ill, but seeing him was different. This was her son, the child the goddess had spared from smallpox. The boy she had dreamed was destined for greatness. And he was dying. She could see it in his wasted frame, in the way he moved, in his eyes. Janaki, now a young woman, stood silent, uncertain how to approach this stranger who was her husband. She had been a child when he left, too young to understand what marriage meant. Now she was 21, old enough to understand that she was about to become a widow. They had barely lived together as husband and wife. He had been gone for most of their marriage. And now he was back, but only to die. The family arranged transport to Kumbakonam. Ramanujan insisted on taking the train rather than travelling by car, despite his weakness. He wanted to see the countryside, to watch the familiar landscape pass by. Rice paddies, palm trees, small villages with their temples. The journey tired him, but he watched intently, as if memorizing everything. They took him to Kumbakonam, to the family house. He lay in the same room where he'd worked as a boy, where he'd first encountered Carr's book, where he'd filled his first notebooks. The room was smaller than he remembered, the ceiling lower, the walls had water stains from monsoon leaks. But it was home. Through the window, he could hear temple bells, the sound carried across the town, marking the hours, calling the faithful to prayer. He could smell incense from the house next door. He could hear children playing in the street, their voices high and bright. All of it was achingly familiar. All of it was what he'd left behind to pursue mathematics in a foreign land. And now he was back, but it was too late. At his mother's house in Kumbakonam, he continued to fill notebooks with new mathematics. He worked when he could sit up. When he was too weak to sit, Janaki would hold a slate for him, and he would dictate formulas, his voice faint but precise. The final notebook, what mathematicians now call the lost notebook, contains some of his most sophisticated work. He was developing what he called mock theta functions, a class of mathematical objects that wouldn't be fully understood until the 1970s. The work consumed him even as his body failed. He would wake in the middle of the night and demand paper. His mother, sleeping nearby, would wake and bring him what he needed. Sometimes he wrote clearly. Sometimes his handwriting deteriorated into barely legible scrawls. But the mathematics was sound. He was seeing patterns that anticipated developments in string theory and black hole physics, fields that wouldn't exist for another 50 years. He was working at the edge of his understanding and the edge of his life simultaneously. On April 26, 1920, Ramanujan died in Kumbakonam. He was 32 years old. His last days were spent working on mathematics, dictating results to his wife Janaki when he was too weak to write. His mother, Kamala, controlled access to him during his final illness. She had always been protective, and now, with death approaching, she became more so. She limited who could visit, when they could come, how long they could stay. Some relatives complained that she was keeping him isolated. She insisted she was protecting him, allowing him peace to do his final work. The exact details of his death remain unclear. Some accounts suggest he was still lucid at the end, still thinking about numbers, still seeing patterns. Others suggest he died in confusion and pain, his brilliant mind finally unable to work through the fog of illness. His mother performed the death rituals, weeping as she washed his body, as she prepared him for cremation. She had dreamed of his greatness, and he had achieved it. But he was still her son, and he had died too young, too far from what should have been a full life. The funeral was attended by family and a few mathematicians from Madras who had supported him over the years. They stood at the cremation ground as his body was burned, watching smoke rise into the Tamil sky. They spoke of his genius, of work that would outlive them all, but they also grieved a life cut short, potential unfulfilled. The obituaries in England were respectful, but carried an undertone of tragedy. Here was a genius who had arrived too late, who had died too young, who might have achieved so much more if only he'd had proper training earlier. If only he'd been discovered sooner, if only he'd been born in a country with better resources. The narrative was one of waste, of potential unfulfilled. But this narrative missed something crucial. Ramanujan hadn't been wasted. He had produced approximately 3,900 mathematical results in his 32 years. He had opened entirely new areas of mathematics. He had worked under conditions that would have crushed most people, and he had kept working until his body failed. The tragedy wasn't that he'd been born in the wrong place. The tragedy was that the right place, Cambridge, the mathematical establishment, the Western Academy, had nearly missed him entirely. Hardy spent the rest of his life thinking about Ramanujan. He edited and published Ramanujan's collected papers in 1927. He wrote extensively about their collaboration, and he wrestled with a question that haunted him. How many other Ramanujans had the world missed? How many geniuses had died unknown in villages and slums and colonial outposts because the structures that claimed to recognize talent were actually designed to recognize conformity? The notebooks were preserved at the University of Madras. For decades, they were studied by mathematicians trying to verify Ramanujan's results. Many could be proven using existing techniques. Some required the development of entirely new mathematical tools. And some remained mysterious, formulas that were clearly true but whose proofs eluded even the best mathematicians. Then in 1976, something extraordinary happened. George Andrews, an American mathematician working in the library of Trinity College, Cambridge, found a sheaf of loose pages in a box labeled Ramanujan's Lost Notebook. They were pages from Ramanujan's final months, material that had been separated from the main notebooks and forgotten. Andrews was working on a completely different project when he stumbled upon the box. He opened it out of curiosity, expecting perhaps some correspondence or minor calculations. What he found astonished him. The pages were filled with formulas, some familiar from Ramanujan's published work, others completely unknown. He took them back to America and began working through them. The Lost Notebook contained some of Ramanujan's most advanced work, the Mach theta functions he'd been developing in his final year. These weren't just curious mathematical objects. They were structures that would prove essential to modern number theory, to string theory, to the mathematics of black holes. Ramanujan, dying in a bed in Kumbakonam in 1920, had been seeing mathematical patterns that wouldn't become scientifically relevant until the 1980s. The discovery of the Lost Notebook sparked a renaissance in Ramanujan's studies. Mathematicians began approaching his work with new tools and new respect. They stopped treating him as a historical curiosity and started treating him as a contemporary. There are mathematicians today who are still proving theorems that Ramanujan stated without proof a century ago. There are results in his notebooks that remain unverified, still waiting for someone to figure out whether they're true. In the 21st century, Ramanujan's work has found unexpected applications. Ken Ono and other mathematicians discovered that Ramanujan's formulas about partition functions connect to the mathematics of black hole entropy. The Mach theta functions appear in string theory. His work on highly composite numbers has applications in computer science and cryptography. Mathematics he created with no thought of application has become essential to understanding the physics of the universe. But perhaps more important than the specific results is what Ramanujan represents. He demonstrated that mathematical genius can emerge anywhere, that the structures meant to identify and nurture talent can be wrong, that intuition and rigor are not opposites but partners. He showed that the Western mathematical tradition, for all its power, doesn't have a monopoly on mathematical truth. The standard narrative about Ramanujan emphasizes his discovery by Hardy as if genius only becomes real when validated by the West. But this gets the story backward. Ramanujan was already a genius when Hardy found him. Hardy's contribution was recognition, not creation. And the delay in that recognition, the years Ramanujan spent in poverty, the scholarships he lost, the examinations he failed, those weren't accidents. They were features of a system designed to reward conformity and punish deviation. Think about what it means that Ramanujan had to cross the ocean, had to violate his religion, had to enter a culture that was hostile to everything he was, in order to get the recognition his work deserved. Think about what it means that Indian mathematicians like V. Ramaswamy Iyer recognized his genius years before Hardy did, but their recognition didn't count, didn't matter, didn't translate into resources or opportunity. Think about the assumption still visible in how the story is told, that a genius isn't really a genius until Cambridge says so. Ramanujan's wife, Janaki Ammal, lived until 1994. She gave interviews in her later years, and they complicate the romantic narrative. She described Ramanujan as kind but distant, absorbed in mathematics to the exclusion of almost everything else. She talked about the difficulties of their marriage, the interference of his mother, the poverty, the separation when he went to England. She had been a child bride, married to a man she barely knew. As she grew older, she came to understand that her husband was famous, that people travelled from around the world to see the house where he'd lived. But during the marriage itself, she had felt lonely and confused. She preserved his legacy, but she also made clear that life with a genius is not the same as the stories told about genius. His mother, Kamala, lived long enough to see her son become famous. Whether she understood what his mathematics meant is unclear. She preserved his notebooks. She told stories about his childhood, about the dreams she'd had, about the goddess Namagiri and the divine origin of his formulas. How much of this was true and how much was retrofitting, we can't know. Memory and myth blend together in the stories families tell about the extraordinary among them. There's a question that people still ask about Ramanujan. Where did the formulas come from? How did he think? What was actually happening in his mind when he produced those results? And the honest answer is, we don't know. We have theories. Some mathematicians think he had exceptional visual spatial intuition, that he could see patterns in mathematical objects the way some people can rotate complex shapes in their heads. Some think he had extraordinary computational ability, that he could perform mental calculations that allowed him to test hypotheses quickly. Some think there was a genuine mystical element, that his religious practice put him in a state where mathematical insight flowed more freely. Ramanujan himself attributed his results to the goddess Namagiri. He said she appeared to him in dreams, that she wrote equations on his tongue, that she showed him scrolls of complex formulas. Western mathematicians have generally dismissed this as metaphor or cultural colouring, but they have no better explanation to offer. The working in his notebook shows systematic development of ideas, not random divine downloads. But the origin of the ideas, where the initial insights came from, remains mysterious. There's a tendency to want to solve this mystery, to reduce Ramanujan to a cognitive mechanism we can understand and potentially replicate. But perhaps the mystery is the point. Perhaps what Ramanujan represents is the irreducible strangeness of human creativity, the way genuine originality will always exceed our frameworks for understanding it. The mathematical community has memorialized Ramanujan in various ways. There's a Ramanujan journal devoted to areas of mathematics he influenced. There are annual conferences. In India, December 22nd, his birthday, is celebrated as National Mathematics Day. There's a museum in his honor in Kumbakonam. Trinity College has a memorial, and his rooms have been preserved. In 2015, a film was made about his life, The Man Who Knew Infinity, based on Robert Canigal's biography. The film follows the standard narrative: poor Indian clerk, genius discovered, journey to Cambridge, productive collaboration, early death. It's a good film, well acted, emotionally powerful. It's also necessarily a simplification. The complexity of Ramanujan's thought, the texture of his struggles, the specific nature of his achievement, these things resist dramatization. The film makes him sympathetic, which is important, but it also makes him comprehensible, which might be a betrayal. Because the truth about Ramanujan is that he remains in crucial ways incomprehensible. We can verify his theorems, we can apply his formulas, we can trace his influence through subsequent mathematics, but we cannot fully explain how someone with his background produced what he produced. And maybe that's as it should be. Maybe the right relationship to genius is not understanding but wonder. There's a famous story about Hardy visiting Ramanujan in the hospital. Hardy arrived in a taxi, and he mentioned to Ramanujan that the taxi's number, 1729, seemed rather dull. Ramanujan immediately replied, "No, it is a very interesting number. It is the smallest number expressible as the sum of two cubes in two different ways. And indeed it is. 1729 equals 1 cubed plus 12 cubed, and also 9 cubed plus 10 cubed." The story is often told to illustrate Ramanujan's computational ability, his intimate familiarity with numbers. But notice what it actually shows. He had apparently thought about this property before. He had catalogued it in his mind. The number 1729 wasn't random to him. It was specific, interesting, connected to a pattern. His mind was organized around these patterns, these relationships, these hidden structures. He lived in a mathematical landscape the rest of us can barely see. The partition function that Hardy and Ramanujan worked on together has a beautiful practical interpretation. It asks, in how many different ways can you break a number into a sum of positive integers? For small numbers, you can list them out. 4 can be partitioned as 4, or 3 plus 1, or 2 plus 2, or 2 plus 1 plus 1, or 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1. That's 5 partitions. But as numbers get larger, the count explodes. The partition function grows rapidly, and finding a formula for it seemed impossible. Ramanujan developed techniques that produced an asymptotic formula, not an exact answer, but an approximation that gets more accurate as the numbers get larger. The formula is complex, involving modular forms and infinite series. But what's remarkable is that Ramanujan intuited the shape of the solution before he could prove it. He knew what the answer had to look like, and he worked backward to find a path to it. This was typical of his method. He would see the destination and then construct a route. It's the opposite of how mathematics is usually taught, where you start from axioms and build up to conclusions through careful logic. Ramanujan started from conclusions and worked back to justifications. Hardy found this both frustrating and exhilarating. It meant that collaboration involved constantly asking Ramanujan to slow down, to explain, to show his work. And Ramanujan would try, but the explanations were often inadequate, because the real explanation was inaccessible even to him. In his final months, bedridden in Kumbakonam, Ramanujan was working on mock theta functions. To understand what these are requires technical mathematics, but the basic idea is this. There are certain mathematical objects called theta functions that have elegant symmetry properties. Mock theta functions look similar, but break the symmetry in subtle ways. They're almost theta functions, but not quite. They occupy a strange intermediate category. Ramanujan discovered these objects through pattern recognition. He saw formulas that seemed to behave like theta functions but didn't quite fit. Instead of dismissing them as errors, he investigated further. He developed a theory of these intermediate objects, these mocks, and he did this while dying, while barely able to write, while aware that he was running out of time. The lost notebook contains pages and pages of mock theta function identities, stated without proof, organized thematically. When George Andrews found these pages in 1976, it took him years to verify even a fraction of them. Some required entirely new mathematical techniques to prove. Some connected to areas of mathematics that hadn't existed in Ramanujan's lifetime. The mock theta functions turned out to be crucial to understanding modular forms, which are in turn crucial to string theory and the mathematics of black holes. This means that Ramanujan, in 1920, dying in a small town in colonial India, was doing mathematics that would only become scientifically relevant 60 years later. He wasn't working toward any application. He wasn't trying to solve physics problems. He was following patterns, pursuing beauty, trusting that the mathematics would matter even if he couldn't say how. There's a profound faith in that. Faith that mathematical truth is worth pursuing for its own sake. Faith that patterns discovered in pure thought connect to patterns in the physical world. Faith that the work will outlive the worker, that someone will come later and understand what you were seeing. Ken Ono, a mathematician who has spent decades studying Ramanujan's work, discovered something astonishing in the 2010s. Some of Ramanujan's formulas about partition functions, when translated into the language of modern physics, describe the entropy of black holes. The mathematics Ramanujan was doing, without knowledge of general relativity, without knowledge of black holes, without any physics training, anticipated structures that would only be discovered when physicists tried to reconcile quantum mechanics with gravity. How is this possible? The standard answer is that mathematics is the language of nature, that mathematical structures discovered abstractly will eventually find physical application. But this feels inadequate. It's not just that Ramanujan's mathematics became useful, it's that he seemed to be seeing something, perceiving a pattern that connected number theory to the geometry of space-time decades before anyone knew such a connection could exist. This is where the goddess Namagiri becomes difficult to dismiss entirely. Not because we should accept literal divine intervention in mathematics, but because we need some way to account for insight that seems to transcend the available information. Ramanujan was looking at patterns in numbers, and those patterns turned out to describe the physics of black holes. Either this is an extraordinary coincidence, or mathematics has a unity that we don't fully understand, or Ramanujan was accessing something, intuition, pattern recognition, some cognitive process we can't name, that allowed him to perceive connections that shouldn't have been visible yet. The 3 notebooks that survive from his years in India contain approximately 3,000 results. Mathematicians have been working through them for over a century. Most have been verified, some have been proven false. A significant number remain unverified. The statement looks plausible, the pattern seems right, but no one has found a proof. These unverified results sit in a strange epistemic space. They're probably true. Ramanujan's hit rate was very high, but probably isn't certainty, and mathematics demands certainty. There's something poignant about this. Results that Ramanujan saw with perfect clarity, that were obvious to him, remain unproven after 100 years of work by professional mathematicians. It suggests that his way of seeing was genuinely different, that he had access to a mode of mathematical perception that can't be easily transmitted or replicated. The examination system that failed Ramanujan wasn't accidental. It was designed to produce a specific kind of subject, compliant, broadly educated, fluent in the colonizer's language and values. It was designed to identify people who could be absorbed into the colonial administrative apparatus. Genius that didn't fit this template was not just overlooked, it was actively punished. Ramanujan failed not because he lacked ability, but because his ability was the wrong kind. This has implications that extend far beyond one man's story. How many other Ramanujans have existed? How many people with extraordinary gifts in mathematics or science or art have been filtered out by systems that reward conformity over creativity? How many times has genius been labeled as failure because it appeared in the wrong body, spoke the wrong language, came from the wrong place? The miracle isn't that Ramanujan succeeded. The miracle is that we know about him at all. He succeeded despite the system, not because of it. He succeeded because a few individuals, V. Ramaswamy Iyer in India, G.H. Hardy in England, chose to look past credentials and conventions and actually see what was in front of them. How much has been lost because those individuals weren't there? Because the work was dismissed unread, because genius went unrecognized until it was too late? Hardy wrote after Ramanujan's death that working with him was the most singular experience of his mathematical life. Hardy was a great mathematician in his own right, one of the finest of his generation. But he knew that Ramanujan was something else, something rarer. He wrote that Ramanujan's was the only absolutely first-rate mathematician he had ever known who had not been trained at a great school. This was meant as a compliment, but it carries an assumption that great mathematics normally requires great schools, that Ramanujan was an exception. But what if the exception reveals the rule to be wrong? What if mathematical ability is far more widely distributed than our institutions assume? What if the schools and examinations and credential systems don't identify talent so much as filter for class, background, and conformity? Ramanujan proved that you don't need formal training to do mathematics at the highest level. You need mathematical ability, yes. You need obsessive dedication, absolutely. But you don't need the institutional pathway. You don't need to pass examinations in subjects you don't care about. You don't need to signal your belonging to the educated class. You need mathematics, and you need the freedom to pursue it. The tragedy is how rare that freedom is. Ramanujan had it only in fragments. The years of poverty when no one expected anything from him, the sympathetic supervisor at the Port Trust who gave him time to work, the collaboration with Hardy who respected his methods. Most of his life was spent fighting for the space to do what he was born to do. His wife Janaki described him as kind but absent. He would forget to eat. He would work through the night. He would be physically present but mentally elsewhere, lost in mathematical reverie. This is hard on the people who love you. It's hard to be married to someone whose passion consumes them, who is always partially elsewhere. Janaki didn't have the tools to understand what Ramanujan was doing. She saw a husband who was brilliant and celebrated but also distant and often ill. She saw poverty and struggle and eventual abandonment when he left for England. Her story is part of the cost. So is Ramanujan's health. The move to England was necessary for his work to be recognized, but it killed him. The climate, the diet, the isolation, the stress, all of it contributed to his physical breakdown. He knew the risks. He went anyway. Because the alternative was to spend his life as a clerk, his notebooks gathering dust, his theorems never verified, his gift never fully realized. This is the calculus that genius is forced to make under unjust systems. Stay and be safe but unknown, or go and be recognized but destroyed. Ramanujan chose recognition. He paid for it with his life. And we benefit from that choice every time we use mathematics that he discovered, every time we build on foundations he laid, every time we stand a little closer to understanding the universe because of patterns he saw. There's no way to balance this equation. You cannot weigh 32 years of life against centuries of mathematical progress. You cannot say the trade was worth it, because Ramanujan didn't make a trade. He made a choice under constraint. The choice was shaped by a system that should never have put him in that position. The question Hardy asked, how many Ramanujans has the world missed, has no answer, but it's the right question. It forces us to think about what we lose when we let talent go unrecognized, when we assume that ability looks a certain way or comes from a certain place, when we build systems that filter for credentials rather than capacity. Ramanujan's legacy is not just the mathematics he created, it's the possibility he represents, the possibility that genius is everywhere, that it emerges in unexpected forms, that the structures meant to identify it are often the structures that suppress it. The possibility that if we look with different eyes, if we question our assumptions about who can contribute and how, we might find brilliance in places we've been trained not to look. In 2020, 100 years after his death, mathematicians around the world celebrated Ramanujan's contributions. New results connected to his work continue to be published. The Ramanujan Journal releases several issues each year. Conferences gather researchers working in areas he pioneered. His mathematics is alive, active, generating new knowledge. But more than that, his story is alive. It's told to students who don't fit the standard mold, who struggle with conventional education but have gifts that don't match the categories. It's told to remind people that the gatekeepers can be wrong, that the system can fail to see what's valuable, that persistence and talent can overcome obstacles that seem insurmountable. This telling has to be careful. It can't become a bootstrap narrative, a claim that individual genius is enough, that systemic barriers don't matter because exceptional people will always transcend them. That's not true. Most people who face the barriers Ramanujan faced don't overcome them. Most talent that's dismissed stays dismissed. Most genius that's filtered out by examination systems disappears unrecognized. Ramanujan survived because of a specific combination of factors: his own extraordinary ability, his obsessive dedication, the support of a few key individuals, and enormous luck. Remove any one of those elements and we never hear about him. He's just another clerk in Madras, another failed student, another bright person ground down by poverty and institutional indifference. The right lesson from Ramanujan's story is not that genius will always win. It's that we waste genius constantly, that our systems are designed to waste it, and that we should be horrified by how close we came to losing Ramanujan himself. If Hardy had dismissed that letter, if V. Ramaswamy Iyer hadn't bothered to look at the notebooks, if the supervisor at the Port Trust hadn't been sympathetic, the mathematics would have died with him, the world would be poorer, and we'd never know what we'd lost. Think about that. The mathematics that describes black hole entropy, that advances number theory, that opens new areas of research, it almost didn't exist. It survived because of contingency, because of individuals who chose to look closer when they could have looked away. This should change how we think about talent development. It should make us question every filter we use, every examination we require, every credential we demand, not because all of them are wrong, but because we should be haunted by the possibility of missing the next Ramanujan, the next person whose contribution could transform their field if only someone would recognize what they're offering. The goddess Namagiri, whether literal or metaphorical, represents something important: the acknowledgement that we don't fully understand the sources of creativity. Ramanujan attributed his insights to divine inspiration because he had no better explanation. The mathematical establishment preferred to see it as intuition, as pattern recognition, as some cognitive process that could be naturalized and studied. But maybe both are right. Maybe what we call intuition is mysterious enough that invoking the divine isn't as far off as we think. Maybe the gap between seeing a pattern that no one else sees and claiming that pattern was revealed to you is smaller than it appears. Maybe insisting on purely mechanistic explanations for creativity is itself a kind of reductionism, a refusal to acknowledge that consciousness does things we can't yet explain. This doesn't mean we have to accept literal divine intervention. It means we should stay humble about what we don't know. Ramanujan's mind worked in ways we don't fully understand. That's not a failure of explanation, it's an acknowledgement of mystery. In his final months, when he knew he was dying, Ramanujan kept working. The mock theta functions were his last gift, his final contribution. He was racing against his failing body, trying to record as much as he could before the end. The lost notebook is incomplete, pages missing, arguments abbreviated, results stated without proof. It's a fragment, a window into work that was still developing when death intervened. And yet those fragments have generated decades of mathematics. The mock theta functions opened new areas of research. The identities he stated have been proven, extended, applied. The work was unfinished, but it was generative. It seeded future mathematics in ways Ramanujan couldn't have predicted. This is one way to think about legacy, not as a finished product, but as a seed. You plant something in the world and it grows in ways you can't control, in directions you can't foresee. Ramanujan planted 3,900 seeds, and mathematicians have been cultivating them ever since. The question he asked with his life, whether mathematical truth can be accessed through intuition, whether genius can emerge without institutional support, whether the conventional paths are necessary, remains open. His existence proves that unconventional paths can lead to extraordinary results, but it doesn't prove that such paths are reliable or just. One success doesn't validate a system that creates suffering for everyone else who tries and fails. We celebrate Ramanujan because he succeeded. We should also mourn all the people like him who didn't, who had the same gifts but not the same luck, who died unknown because no Hardy read their letters, because no Ramaswamy Iyer saw their work, because the system ground them down before they could plant their seeds. The memorial to Ramanujan in Kumbakonam stands in the town where he died. Tourists visit, students come to pay respects. The house where he lived has been preserved. These are appropriate honours, but they're also insufficient. The real memorial to Ramanujan would be a world that doesn't require genius to overcome quite so many obstacles, that doesn't make recognition contingent on the approval of distant gatekeepers, that doesn't force people to choose between their gifts and their survival. Hardy lived until 1947. He never stopped thinking about Ramanujan. In his final years, he wrote that his collaboration with Ramanujan was the one romantic incident in his life. Hardy was gay, closeted, living in an era when his sexuality was criminal. The language of romance wasn't casual for him. To use that word meant something specific and profound. He was saying that working with Ramanujan, pursuing mathematics together, was the deepest emotional connection of his life. Deeper than friendships, deeper than family relationships, deeper than anything else he experienced in his 70 years. This is a remarkable admission from a man as private and controlled as Hardy. What did that collaboration give him? On one level, it gave him access to mathematical insights he couldn't have reached alone. Ramanujan's intuition complemented Hardy's rigor in ways that produced genuinely new mathematics. But it gave him something more, a relationship where the barriers that usually separated him from others dissolved. In mathematics, Hardy and Ramanujan could communicate perfectly. The class differences, the cultural gaps, the colonial dynamics, all of it faded when they were working through proofs together. This matters because it reminds us that mathematics, for all its abstraction, is human. It's created by people with feelings, relationships, desires. The theorems may be timeless, but the process of discovering them is temporal, emotional, contingent. Mathematics happens between people, in the space where minds meet and ideas flow, and understanding develops through dialogue. Hardy and Ramanujan weren't just collaborating on proofs. They were sharing something profound, a way of seeing, a dedication to beauty, a commitment to truth that transcended their vastly different backgrounds. They were, in the deepest sense, friends. Not friends in the casual sense of people who socialize and share leisure time, but friends in the sense of souls who recognize each other, who understand what the other values, who share a vision of what matters. Hardy wrote about their work together with a tenderness that appeared nowhere else in his writing. He described Ramanujan's mind with awe. He wrote about the collaboration with something approaching reverence. For a man who cultivated emotional distance, who prided himself on rationality and restraint, this openness is striking. When Hardy received the news of Ramanujan's death, he was devastated. The telegram arrived at Trinity on April 27, 1920. Hardy was in his rooms working on a paper. He opened the telegram, read it, and sat motionless for a long time. Littlewood, arriving for their regular working session, found him staring at nothing. He had known it was coming. The letters from India had been increasingly bleak, but knowing didn't make it easier. Ramanujan's last letter, written barely 2 weeks before his death, had contained new formulas about Mach theta functions. The handwriting was shaky, the paper stained with what might have been water or sweat or tears. But the mathematics was sound. Ramanujan had worked until he literally couldn't hold a pen anymore. Hardy lost his collaborator, his friend, the person who had shown him that mathematics could be more expansive than he'd imagined. He lost the one relationship in his life where he felt truly understood, truly seen. The loss was personal and professional, and something beyond either category. In the weeks that followed, Hardy went through Ramanujan's papers, the materials that had remained in Cambridge when Ramanujan returned to India. There were notebooks filled with results, letters containing theorems, scraps of paper with calculations. Hardy began the work of organizing them, of trying to understand what Ramanujan had been seeing, of preparing them for publication. It became his mission. For the rest of his life, Hardy worked to ensure that Ramanujan's mathematics survived, that the results were verified and published, that the work received the recognition it deserved. He edited Ramanujan's collected papers, published in 1927. He wrote introductions and explanatory notes. He gave lectures about Ramanujan's work, trying to convey to audiences what made it extraordinary. But more than that, Hardy kept Ramanujan alive in memory. He told stories about their collaboration. He described Ramanujan's way of thinking, his intuitive leaps, his mysterious connection to mathematical truth. He made sure that every mathematician who passed through Cambridge heard about Ramanujan, understood who he was and what he'd achieved. In 1940, Hardy gave a series of lectures at Harvard that became his book, A Mathematician's Apology. It's a meditation on what mathematics is, why it matters, what makes it beautiful, and running through it explicitly and implicitly is Ramanujan. Hardy's understanding of mathematical beauty, his appreciation for elegant proof, his conviction that mathematics is an art, all of it was shaped by his collaboration with Ramanujan. There's a passage in the Apology where Hardy discusses mathematical talent, trying to articulate what makes a mathematician great. He describes different kinds of ability, technical skill, creative insight, the capacity for rigorous proof. And he writes that Ramanujan had something beyond all of these, something Hardy calls profound originality, and the ability to see patterns that no one else could see, to perceive mathematical truth directly rather than deriving it through logical steps. Hardy ranks mathematicians on a scale, assigning himself a score of 25. Littlewood gets 30. David Hilbert, one of the great mathematicians of the era, gets 80. And Ramanujan? Hardy gives him 100. It's not a scientific ranking. It's an expression of awe, of recognition that he had encountered a mind that operated on a different level from everyone else he'd known. In the decades after Ramanujan's death, as his notebooks were studied and his results verified, a pattern emerged. The theorems he'd stated without proof were almost always correct. The hit rate was extraordinary. This meant that whatever process he was using, intuition, pattern recognition, divine inspiration, it was reliable. He wasn't guessing. He was seeing something real. This challenges the conventional hierarchy that places proof above insight. The standard view is that a result isn't mathematical truth until it's proven, that stating something without proof is just conjecture. But Ramanujan demonstrated that you can know something is true before you can prove it, that the seeing comes first and the proof comes later, sometimes much later. This has implications for how we teach mathematics, how we value different kinds of mathematical work, how we think about the relationship between intuition and rigor. If we insist that only proven results count, we might discourage the kind of exploratory, intuitive work that generates new ideas. If we overvalue proof at the expense of insight, we might privilege the technicians over the visionaries. The ideal, which Hardy and Ramanujan achieved in their collaboration, is a balance. Hardy brought rigor, Ramanujan brought vision, Together they produced mathematics that neither could have created alone. The tragedy is that the collaboration was so brief that Ramanujan's health failed before they could fully explore the territories he was seeing. In string theory, in number theory, in computer science, in cryptography, mathematicians still cite Ramanujan. His name appears in papers published a century after his death. The Rogers-Ramanujan identities, the Ramanujan conjecture, the Ramanujan tau function, these are not historical curiosities. They are active areas of research. This longevity is remarkable. Most mathematicians, even great ones, see their work superseded within a generation or two. Methods become outdated, problems get solved, new approaches replace old ones. But Ramanujan's mathematics remains fresh because it was so far ahead of its time. He was answering questions that hadn't been asked yet, solving problems that hadn't been formulated, seeing patterns that wouldn't become relevant for decades. There's a story about the cosmos that modern physics tells. The universe is fundamentally mathematical. The patterns that govern stars and atoms, space and time, are mathematical patterns. Physicists discover these patterns by doing mathematics, deriving equations, solving problems, following where the math leads. Ramanujan was doing the same mathematics without knowing where it would lead. He was exploring the territory of mathematical truth for its own sake, and it turned out that this territory mapped onto the physical universe in ways he couldn't have predicted. The partition function describes entropy. The modular forms appear in string theory. The Mach theta functions connect to black hole physics. This suggests something profound about the relationship between mathematics and reality. Either mathematics is embedded in the structure of the universe, or our minds are structured in ways that mirror the universe, or there's some deeper unity that makes pure thought and physical law converge. Ramanujan's life, his work, his strange gift for seeing patterns that others couldn't see, it all points toward this mystery. The question that opens this story, how could someone produce this mathematics from a clerk's desk in colonial India, doesn't have a simple answer. The answer involves genius, yes, but also obsession, isolation, cultural context, historical accident, and a way of thinking that we still don't fully understand. Ramanujan saw mathematics as divine. This was not superstition, it was his experience of the discipline. The patterns were sacred to him. The formulas were revelations. The work was a form of worship. And whether or not we share his religious framework, we can recognize that he was experiencing something real, a connection to mathematical truth that went beyond mere calculation. His mother's dreams about his destiny, his own visions of the goddess Namagiri, his claim that formulas appeared on his tongue while he slept, these cannot be verified or falsified. They are phenomenological reports, descriptions of subjective experience. What matters is that Ramanujan experienced his mathematical work as something that came through him rather than from him. He was a conduit, not a creator. This might explain the lack of proofs. If you're reporting what you see rather than deriving what you prove, the proof isn't the point. The pattern is the point. The truth is the point. The proof is something you provide later for others to convince them of what you already know. Hardy couldn't work this way. He needed the proof to know the result was true. But he came to respect that Ramanujan's way was valid too, that there are different paths to mathematical truth, and that insisting on only one path would mean missing results that were genuinely new. The central paradox of Ramanujan's life is that he succeeded extraordinarily while failing completely. He produced mathematics that changed the field, achieved recognition at the highest level, became the first Indian Fellow of the Royal Society. And he died at 32 in poverty and obscurity, having spent most of his life struggling for recognition, having sacrificed his health and happiness for work that was only beginning to be understood when he died. Both things are true. He succeeded and he failed. He was celebrated and he was destroyed. His mathematics survived and he didn't. There's no resolving this paradox, no narrative frame that makes it coherent. It's just the way it was. What remains is the work. 3,900 results, 3 notebooks and 1 lost notebook, papers in journals, letters to Hardy, a century of mathematicians building on foundations he laid, mathematics that describes the structure of reality in ways he never knew. And the question he asked by existing, what does it mean to know something? How do we recognize truth? Can insight precede proof? Can genius emerge anywhere? What are we missing because we only look in certain places, only trust certain methods, only validate certain kinds of knowledge? Ramanujan didn't answer these questions, he embodied them. His life was the question, the mathematics was the question, the mystery of how he thought, where the formulas came from, what he might have achieved with more time. All of it is question, not answer. And maybe that's the right way to end his story. Not with closure, but with openness. Not with explanation, but with wonder. Not with the claim that we've understood him, but with the acknowledgement that he remains, in crucial ways, beyond our understanding. He saw patterns we're still discovering. He asked questions we're still answering. He demonstrated possibilities we're still exploring. 100 years after his death, Ramanujan is not historical. He's contemporary. He's still here, in the mathematics, in the ongoing work, in every theorem that traces back to something he saw first. The boy in Kumbakonam who found a book of formulas and decided to understand them. The young man who filled notebooks with theorems no one could verify. The clerk who wrote to Cambridge. The mathematician who crossed the ocean. The dying man who dictated mock theta functions to his wife. The genius who claimed a goddess showed him mathematics. The human who struggled and suffered and created and died, too young. All of it is true. All of it is Ramanujan. And the work continues.